So welcome to the second episode of AcademiX. I hope you saw the first episode where Thomas was kind enough to ask about my journey to academia. And today we'll be doing a reverse Uno where we will be asking Thomas on why he landed in academia and if he actually enjoys it. Hopefully. He's kind of mentoring us, so it's important. So Thomas, can you actually tell us how you started with academia? And give a brief picture of what you have done so far for the past 20...
Don't make me look too old.
20-ish years. We don't go there. Okay.
So I started academia with joy and with surprise.
Okay, that's a good start.
I came to academia through multiple factors. I guess my parents, who were in life science, and through various guests they invited who were also in life science and researchers, I started to get a passion for research, academia maybe. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, I ended up, because I chose to study physics in lieu of other traits that I chose not to study, and I can tell you why. But physics brought me into where I am today, which is applied medical physics and in particular medical imaging.
Okay, but why physics particularly? I mean, I know that Germans loved studying physics back in the days, in a good way.
Yeah.
But why physics of all courses?
So
I'm sorry, but just before that, were your parents also physicists?
No.
Okay.
My parents were chemists.
Okay.
And in fact, one of the reasons why I studied physics is exactly that. Wow. So I remember my father wanted to entice my interest in chemistry by giving me one of these toy boxes where you can set up your own experiments.
Okay.
But under the hawkish eyes of my father, I felt highly uncomfortable. Plus, I was not really good at mixing stuff. And even though we had some failed and also some good, well-going experiments on our balcony, I ultimately decided not to study chemistry because I was a bit fearful that I would be, big brothers watching me too much. Yeah. So then I said I want to study medicine. And unfortunately, my guinea pig at the time died. And I started to realize that I can't deal with deaths or dead objects, animals, people. And I told my parents that I now want to become a philosopher. And luckily, in retrospect, they held me back and said they would suggest studying something else. And ultimately, it was physics, because I had found out that physics is quite a encompassing science, with elements of philosophy, mathematics, even chemistry. I would argue that chemistry is really everything. Everything is physics in chemistry. Okay. It's the interaction of electron shells. I don't know if you would agree as an engineer, but physics I felt highly comfortable with. Plus I knew people who studied physics and they seemed to be good lads. And so I applied for a physics study.
Okay. So, I mean, physics is quite broad, right?
Yes.
You can have theoretical physics, you can have applied ones. But what pivoted you to study medical physics of all the domains?
Well, I actually became a student at the University of Leipzig, which started with a physics curriculum that was quite broad. But I realized fairly soon, which is 2 weeks into the studies, that all my grades that I gathered in mathematics before in school must have been fake grades, because I plummeted from an average 1.0, one being the best grade you could get, to about 3.5.
That's a dose, yeah.
And it was a serious drop in the cold water, and I realized that I struggled immensely with mathematics. And even though I found the lectures of quantum physics quite enticing, I couldn't really get my head around it.
Okay.
And at the time, I was pushed closer to medical physics because of my parents working in the field of nuclear medicine. And so I always knew that there was a path of applied science that could, with a fairly short path links, help patients. And I had some experience with people who had worked in the field of PET, positron emission tomography, which all in all enticed me to seek a master thesis topic in the field of PET. And there's something interesting happened. So I applied for a master thesis in PET, but I looked for supervisors.
Okay.
And I went to the head of nuclear medicine at the University of Leipzig Hospital and asked him if he could supervise me. And he said it's too much physics. Okay. And then I went to the head of physics at the University of Leipzig, and he said it's too much medicine in it.
I think they just didn't want to take you.
This might be a
We do this often.
Although at that time the grades weren't that bad. Now, but what I'm saying is that it's an interesting observation that if, in my experience, when I chose applied science as a master topic, that the two ends of the bandwidth that would join in this field would not easily accept you as a PhD student. Which is interesting, because if you do a master thesis in applied science, do you then need 2 mentors, 3 mentors, multiple mentors? Or what would it take for a mentor to take you on as a PhD student?
I mean, this was something, so this was in the
I did my master in 1994.
Okay, so how do you think this has changed? Do you think that the trend of when you do an applied research now, do you think that there is 2 polar sides who really don't support each other, or what do you feel? Do you think this trend that existed before, is it still present there now? At least in Europe. I'm not sure about the US, but...
That's a very good question. I'm afraid I can't answer this. I would argue that at the time, in the early 1990s, the field of PET imaging, which I chose to enter, was perhaps in European context a little premature. And perhaps people, even though they knew about it, there were very few installations of this tomography, and even academic institutes would not feel that easy. And when you don't feel easy, you actually impose yourself as being the only leader. So perhaps the medical doctors thought there was too little medicine and too much physics, and he felt insecure. And the same happened on the other end. I can't really answer your question. I have a sense that today science becomes even more specialized. And I wonder if, at least in my experience, if you have challenges like this popping up so many times that you don't find the right mentor. I'm not quite sure.
So, obviously in Leipzig there you didn't get support. So how did you transit from Leipzig to your actual master thesis place?
I actually, so I should add that I was born in 1970. I grew up in the former GDR, and I'm saying this because it answers your question. During the 1980s, my father invited a guest speaker to talk about PET imaging. Even though they had interest in a PET program, chances of getting a PET system during the so-called GDR times were fairly slim. But a guy came who actually had worked with PET, a guy called David Townsend, and we showed him around. He saw the radiochemistry facilities, and I showed him around and spoke a little bit of English, and we stayed in touch. And during the physics studies, he knew what I was doing, and he essentially had just moved to the United States, starting a PET imaging program at the University of Pittsburgh. And I was fortunate enough that he called me and said, would you want to do your master thesis with us? And this was preceded by a practical spell that I had with him as a summer student. So at the University of Leipzig, we had the opportunity to go out for a 6 or 8 month practical spell or sabbatical, whatever you call this. And I chose to go to Switzerland and also work with him for a couple of weeks. And during those times, this was 1992, 93, he initiated the concept of a combined PET-CT tomograph, which now both of us are working with. And since then we stayed in touch, and he knew that I struggled finding a proper mentor for the master thesis. So he said, let's do it in Pittsburgh. And you guys in Leipzig have to do very little. I'll mentor him, and then you submit your thesis, and it was accepted. So I talked to my immediate mentor in Leipzig. He was okay with it. And I submitted a master thesis on the topic of CT-based attenuation correction, a playground for a plethora of physicists in the field. I submitted it in 1995 and got a master's in physics.
So I just wanted to follow up on this particular aspect. How important do you think was that master thesis throughout your academic career?
Very, 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 very important, because for me, that's a subjective experience, I engaged with a supervisor who later became my PhD mentor. And it grew in a extremely trusted and sustainable relationship. So I was really fortunate, and I built on the network that he opened to me during the master thesis. Plus, I was luxurious enough to be on a project that seemingly became successful. So it feels a bit like a chosen one, but mainly out of luck, and perhaps not so much.
I would actually say that. But do you also believe in this approach of having the right cup of coffee with another person? Because back, at least when I started my PhD, I had people who say that you should always have a cup of coffee, but most importantly, you should have the cup of coffee with the right person who can advise you. In your case, it was David Townsend, I would say, and it has turned out quite well for you. I would.
Are you referring to? So I know you like these paraphrases or these pictures that you paint to explain. Are you referring to the gut feeling, whether you warm up to someone, or are you referring to?
Yeah, I think because when you warm up to both, I would say, like to go to a person and think of him as a mentor and ask for opinions and stuff. You would not do that if you don't warm up to the person, I would say.
Absolutely.
So because what I see with the new PhDs or the people in my generation is that they tend to talk to other PhDs, which is great, but I don't think it is that great when it comes to like designing your future prospect. I think every person who is starting out their career should have some kind of mentor whom they look up to. And that's why I believe that you should have the right cup of coffee who has gone through the path.
So in our case, it was a slice of pizza. So I told you I did this summer sabbatical, and this was in Villingen in Switzerland. And the guy who looked after me later ended up in pharma industry. He was an imaging physicist, a very bright guy. And my task was, in retrospect, an absolute simple, idiotic, stupid task. A total slavery task. And I was so fond of it. Because it was a new country, it was a new experience. And at one time, he did what a good mentor does. He says, Thomas, I'm going to take you on a trip to Geneva, and you're going to meet one of the brightest people I ever know, David Townsend.
Cool.
And we'll just have a dinner. You tell him what you do. I have some work things to talk to him about. And so we did. And then something really interesting happened, which normally would think a mentorship or mentee mentorship would set on the wrong foot. So David heard about my topic, and he said, this is complete bullshit what you do. This is really stupid, and it's a waste of time. And he, being British, formulated it a little better, right?
Politely.
But even as a German, I could see through it. And it made me uncomfortable. But this was the start of a fantastic relationship, because he then, a few weeks later, called me and said, would you want to work for me? And I have, the idea of a PET-CT. You can start doing some pilot work on attenuation correction. And this turned out to be the seeding of a fantastic path that I was fortunate enough to walk on. But it started with an abrasive comment.
I mean, it's funny because for me, it was the same as well. So when I presented my work here for my PhD, the first thing was like, I think it was Otto as well. So the other mentor I had, he said, look at me. Whatever you did and whatever your supervisor asked you to do is absolutely stupid. And then I was like, okay, that's cool. That's cool. And I thought I would never get this job, but I think we bonded later.
So I think you could argue that this is arrogant of the older people to say, but I would argue that if you see a diamond shining through in the younger person, it's also an immediate sign of trust. I know this sounds really weird, but why would I not tell you an honest opinion if I wouldn't care about you? So I remembered this when we interviewed you, that we told you that your master thesis was perhaps not the best thing you could do.
So talking about honest reviews, you had a British supervisor, right? And you told that he was quite abrasive as well. So when you did your actual PhD, you must have gone through a particular journey where you start with not knowing much, but then you start getting used to doing all the stuff. How did your PhD how did your supervisor actually deliver the feedbacks? Was he like, look, I'm not trying to offend you, but I would like to let you know? Is it because you probably know that the old way of saying things do not work anymore, considering you have changed how the PhDs have evolved?
Yes.
So how was it? How was it with Townsend, and how do you think it has changed right now?
It has changed tremendously, and you and I, who we work together here in Vienna, experience this day by day. When I was a PhD student, again, speaking only from my experience, I was with a couple of other PhD students of my age. We were about 22, 24-ish, Americans and other international people in the PET center. So this was within a hospital with clinicians and academics working very close together. I struggled first thing when I came to America with the language. It started off with the phrase, how are you doing? And me, who had only school pidgin English, I thought they meant it serious. So I met the first guy on the hallway. He said, how are you doing, Tom? And I thought he was really interested. And by the time I had explained myself, he was in the coffee kitchen. So David was a bit different. He was an ambassador to the nation of the United States because he has lived there for a year or so. He was a fantastic mentor because he did spend time on an evolving project, intense time. I would show him results. He would critique it, but he would not be withholding with his critique. He would not reformulate it in an utterly polite way.
Okay.
I remember when I gave him texts that I wrote, he would start correcting them, and there was a lot of red, believe me. And then after half a page or one page, he would stop, and I thought the text was fine, and until he gave it back to me and said, unless you really come up with the proper, well-phrased English, I'm not going to read it again. Fuck off. I didn't say the last one, but that's what he meant. And, it was... you could tell he was really working hard on it, but at some point he's just said, look, it has to be written upside down. So the way we received critique was different from now. It was perhaps harmful, or it hurt. Hurt is the better way of saying it, but it was not meant to be disrespectful. And I think it has to do with the way you work on a project together. For him, it was a high-risk project.
Yeah.
He won an NIH grant, an R01, which was rejected in the first place, but then he won it. It's a huge responsibility that's on you. It was not a fishing expedition, but whether or not the device would be successful wasn't quite clear. And then you had people who worked with it, and you want to make sure they stay on board. Yeah. But you also don't have a lot of time of saying, how do you feel today? Are you okay? Shall we go have a cup of coffee? So we did all this, but on the go. And it was a unique relationship where, as I know you do as well, you mingle empathy with respect and scientific mentorship, which is factual and ultimately follows a disciplinary path.
But how did you take it? Because you were a young bloke who actually went to the US, and then you see your supervisor who was not particularly polite about giving comments. Well, how did you take it? Did you take it personally, or did you think like, okay, he's saying something, probably it's a chance to improve? Or was it like, okay, screw this?
So I'm alone. So I have no brothers and sisters. So as a lonely child, you take critique differently than when you have brothers and sisters. Yeah. So yes, of course, I was hurt. But given the fact that he was British, he had a very peculiar way of relaying it that was funny. And in fact, being German, I sourced a lot from his sense of humor. So he was actually putting his critique in sometimes humorous, sarcastic, Blackadder type comments, and that made it more palatable. Okay. But I appreciate critique that comes up front. Okay. And that you know exactly what you can improve on.
But how do you see it right now? You said it has changed immensely.
Yes.
And as a professor right now who's also mentoring a lot of PhD students, how easy or hard do you find it to give an honest critique to the younger generation? Because the generation right now is definitely different than the past. So how do you do it, and how do you feel about it?
We promised when you and I started the podcast that we would be honest and we would not be deliberately aggressive, right? But the problem is that I think a lot of the students who come in today are they have experienced a lot of comfort, and I wonder sometimes if it's again my age that I became like those people who when I was younger didn't want to become, who were like in a Muppet Show grumping in the back, or whether it's a true change in the next generation. I feel that many of them take stuff for given and do not appreciate what it takes to get a position cleared up. Expectation management is different. Perhaps it has to do with the way they were brought up, that, everything was fine, everything was given, and they assume it continues like this. I find it extremely hard, relaying critique or setting up boundary conditions, because I feel that they might feel offended. They might feel trod on their toes. It's difficult for me, and I must say it's the biggest challenge being a professor in finding the right intonation of steering the younger people today who are about half my age.
So you say when you find it difficult, but
Yes.
what is your immediate knee-jerk reaction that you get from the PhD students or your postdocs when you give a harsh critique like David probably did or people back in the days did? What is the knee-jerk reaction of the PhD students, and what is the most common one that you see from your mentees?
Well, if I say this now in full transparency, it's easy to backtrack it and people can find out who works for us. But I try to phrase it more generically. Sulking. No, first of all, first reaction is silence. It mum's the word. Secondly, sulking. Thirdly, defense mechanism, but without adding substance, just to make sure that what has been thrown at them is being reverted and just setting up a security boundary shell around them, but not really thinking of the critique as a contextual matter. But then ultimately, of course, there is improvement, but you have to nudge this improvement. It's my experience. You have to constantly say, did you understand what I tried to say? Can we work on this? Do you want to show me the intermittent steps? I painted a little bit darkly, and there are students who are easier to deal with. Your question sounds simple, but I don't really have a short answer to it. We've seen, and you and I work with similar students and even the same students. We've seen a whole range of them. And we in fact have done a lot of interviews, if I might throw the question back at you, where we experienced again a variety of reactions and expectations of students. I think it has to do with the fact that there is a notion in society that having a PhD is good, and they know there is a PhD position, but they actually have no passion for science. This, I think, is one of the issues that makes it difficult to find the right candidates to come on board. And if we choose them for whatever reasons, it might not turn out to be an easy fit. But coming back to your questions, relaying critique.
Actually, the last one was quite interesting. You said that the current generation seems to be not warming up to or not that passionate about science. So let's do this back and forth thing. Do you think that, so back then you must have also had other PhD. So when you were a PhD student, you must have had other PhD colleagues. Why did you guys do a PhD? Do you think that the rigor that you guys had back in the days was much stronger than whatever you see in the new crop of PhD students?
When I did a PhD, the ones that were closest to me were in the PET center. And I can only say that at those times in the late 1990s, we were on developing something great. I know this is a bad aftertaste, but we really felt we were part of a really invigorating path to something bigger, be it developing a hybrid imaging modality or other people at the same center developed the Pittsburgh compound, the C11 based Alzheimer tracer, which turned out to be a huge success. So everybody who at that time worked at the Pittsburgh PET Center knew that they were part of a bigger thriving team. And I think this led to the fact that you had a passion for science, and it was not so much the drive to get a degree. And in fact, all of those who were studying at the same time as I did went on a scientific path afterwards.
Because now it's interesting. You felt the people back in the days, they were really motivated on carrying out a PhD because they felt that they were a part of something bigger.
Yeah, I think so.
Do you think it has changed right now? Because it happens often. So when you think that you belong to a part of something which is much bigger than whatever you're doing, you tend to give 110%.
Right. So
when you think about the new PhD students, do you think they don't feel that way? Because if they don't feel that way, I think it's on us as mentors because we didn't motivate them enough that why they're a part of a much bigger project, or how do you think? Or it's like a mixture?
Well, the people at the time in the Pittsburgh PET Center had actually gone through prior training. They were already prior to their PhD studies somehow affiliated with the center. They did either a master's or they came sniffing in the department during their studies. So I think that helps. But certainly they had very strong personalities as mentors.
Okay.
Extremely strong.
Okay.
People, but also people with a international background, and the background, like Townsend worked at different places. Paul Kinahan came in later. Chad Mathis, the chemist, worked at different places. So all this added and helped. Plus, it was what you always describe as warming up. It was the gut feeling that they all went along well. There was somehow the soft skills, the emotional intelligence that bonded them. I remember, for example, when we didn't write papers, we played marathon, which was a shooting game at the time, or we played tennis in the hallway of the pet center. So all this bonds. But your point is very well taken. Are we doing enough as mentors to entice the PhD students about a project? Take our example, for example. So you and I work in, let's call it whole person research, right? We believe that you can explain it better than I do, but we can go beyond PET imaging by employing other signals from wearables, from epidemiology, and build a stronger model to disease, especially health to disease transition. That's a great vision, right? If you can contribute with your own little area through some means, be it imaging or engineering, to a bigger theme. Are we doing enough to relay this to the PhD students who come in on a grant that covers only a small aspect of it? Is that the complexity that we're facing? Is it a shift in the generation that we are not yet got our heads around how to deal with? Or that we don't spend enough time? Is it ultimately the fact that we only have 3 years that we have funding to mentor a PhD student? And if we have people who we think are raw diamonds but come from a different domain, we source them from a different ground and now want to move them to another ground. Do we have enough time to let them in on the new domain? We need teaching. They need to find some time on, sniffing around. I think this is a complex.
Actually, it's a layered problem, right?
Absolutely.
I would say. Yeah. So, just going back to your path, after you finished your PhD, you had your, I would say, 5 minutes of fame.
15. It was a bit more. Come on, it was a PET CT.
It was just 15 minutes of fame. Okay, 15 minutes of fame. So you're pretty young at the time, right? I remember if you're like a PhD student and suddenly your work comes in front of the Times magazine and you are introduced like, oh, it's the first team who built the PET CT. So how did it feel as a young PhD?
Awesome. Yeah. Awesome. I have to say it. I mean, I didn't make any buck of it, but
I tell you, if this guy had Instagram at that time.
No, but it was unbelievable. It makes you proud.
Yeah.
But also, no, it doesn't really make you modest. It makes you proud, and sometimes you're inhibited. I'm lacking the true English word of explaining this. It was a bit of a roller coaster. But it's of course cool if you're invited to stage and saying he's part of the team who developed the first PET CT.
Cool.
Fantastic. But, right? So the 15 minutes of fame.
Yeah.
If they come too early, and at that age, I was about 29 to 31-ish.
Okay.
It's too early in your life.
Why do you say it's too early?
Because it's like flying business class for the first time.
And you always want to fly business class
Exactly.
again.
It's like, eating Michelin star cuisine. You do it the first time. That wasn't bad. I want to do it again. So there is an element of that because we're all ridden by egos at some point. You start forgetting the work that got into this, like David writing the grant, being rejected, and then the grant writing, for example, you and I experienced this a lot, right? But you asked me, how did it feel? It was fantastic at the time. You can ride the wave for a few years, but ultimately it levels off. It actually levels so much off that when there is an anniversary on PET CT, you wonder why your name doesn't come up.
Man, this is hilarious.
PET CT actually was a success story, and today, just for stats purposes, we have about 6,000-7,000 systems installed worldwide, which I think is, considering that the first commercial version was come out in 2001, it's quite an achievement, and it has found its way into clinical practice.
So I'm trying to understand your mental state, because I know what I would have done if I was in the stage where like I got my 15 minutes of fame. Obviously, you would have been considered like how to say, a very serious scientist by the time you had your PhD.
Yes.
So what were the opportunities that was laid out in front of you? Because it was the place you were working was later absorbed by Siemens as well.
Yeah, it was a bit complicated. So Pittsburgh remained as an academic center, but it was a project, this NIH grant, that was done in cooperation with a company called CTI Pet Systems, who was bought up by Siemens.
Okay.
Now, clearly, at this stage, when it became a commercial entity or success, companies would storm in and want to buy it, right?
Okay.
Buy PET-CT. And you get exposed to industry, of course, as well. During my PhD, I actually went several times to CTI and got a feel for what it is like to do a product development. So when you say what were the options that were laid out to me, it was actually quite clear that it was an industrial path.
Yeah.
And in fact, I joined CTI Pet Systems before I submitted my PhD thesis.
Nice. Okay.
But no, simply because the funding ran out.
Okay.
And so I had to look for an opportunity. The thesis was essentially written, but the whole defense stuff still had to take place. So I chose CTI Pet Systems to work for them, because it gave me the opportunity to continue working in the field of PET-CT. So I was a research scientist support who followed the first installations of PET-CT.
Cool.
They were done worldwide.
Yeah.
And I was working in the clinical research group in CTI, within CTI. And I remember in the first podcast, we already hinted on the fact that you can have research going on in industry and in academia. And this was one of the examples. And CTI, much like other companies, was very fond of keeping a research group. And being part of it gives you a whole different perspective on doing science.
But so you were a part of industry right now. So how did you pivot back to academia?
So that was very simple. So we actually went out and did the first 10 installations of PET-CT worldwide. And it was the most interesting experience because you felt it was part of you that got installed. You met clinicians, users. So the 15-minute of fame continued for a bit. But then ultimately we ended up in Essen, Germany. You studied in Aachen, so Essen is close by, and you've seen places like Shanghai, Hong Kong. You've seen the world, if I can say this a bit pathetically, and then you're being asked to go to Essen. So you say, why? And Essen was brilliant. It was a site where radiology and nuclear medicine, unheard of before in Germany, partnered and said, we want to have a PET-CT.
Amazing.
And when we installed it, something else amazing happened. I fell in love with the lead technologist. So combined imaging gets a whole different meaning now. So I fell in love with her and I said, I actually want to live with her.
Okay.
And the university offered me a position which was split between radiology and nuclear medicine. And I felt this was perfect.
Okay.
See, as a physicist, I felt the invention we did, which is the combination of the two systems, should be used by everybody. What we did not see was the Cold War situation between radiology and nuclear medicine. But for us as physicists, this was non-existent because it's a machine. You should use it. So I moved to Essen and moved back into academia and became a postgraduate in Essen.
So the main reason why you moved to academia was because of your wife?
Yeah. Well, not yet wife, but
we
married and we're still married and happily so. So it was for love reasons.
Okay, that has an entirely new spin. I thought you had some philosophical reason, so we can end the interview here. No, okay, please go on.
No, and then it was a very good 5 years in Essen. And after that, I got an offer by a Swiss startup in Zurich that did imaging for pharmaceutical industry, whether I wanted to work for them. Okay. And I chose to do that. So we moved to Switzerland. Okay. And after a year's time, there was a bit of a turmoil with the startup. And I chose to set up my own company. And that's essentially what happens. This took me for about 8 years. And then the position in Vienna came up. So I'm doing a roller coaster ride through about 20 years. And I was elected as the best suitable candidate. And we met then a few years later. Yeah.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around because it is kind of interesting. So if I was in an industry, so if I had my own company or if I'm in an industry, my logical choice would be like to go to another industry for a better pay and whatever, like negotiate for a better position. Why did you decide to, I mean, professorship is still a good position, but why did you try to pivot back to academia? Or is it something that you really wanted all the time? It was at the back of your head. or what was your actual rationale?
No, it was not. So when I went for this startup, in fact, I left out one station, which is that I joined a big international company for who you had worked as well.
Yes.
And in fact, there it worked that you negotiated a 20% higher salary. It's sort of rule of thumb. You change jobs within industry, 10, 20% salary increase if you manage to get that position. And then I realized what I did in that company I could do on my own. So I set up a consulting business in hybrid imaging, and I've always stayed in hybrid imaging. And part of the contracts we got were, for example, research management. So I worked in Denmark for 2 years, and it was exciting. And while you do have a commercial business, you could stay at the tune and pulse of academia.
That's a luxurious
And I
position,
even published during those times.
Yeah.
So I think by focusing on your trade, your experience, which is hybrid imaging, and maintaining that path, it's a bit easier to transit between industry and academia if you choose to do that. Ultimately, it was money. There was the crisis, as you may know, 2018, budget came down. Our sponsors or contractors retracted, and the position in Vienna came up, again thinking that it would be a perfect match of radiology and nuclear medicine. So I applied, and I could show that I had worked continuously, plus bringing in some industry experience, which apparently was convincing enough. So this is why I came back. But that second or the last transition was purely out of financial. Shouldn't be saying this. Hopefully the rector will not listen. But it was driven. It was driven by financial issues.
I was always like thinking there should be like some deep philosophical.
You really
meaning.
think so?
Yeah, I was like, but this is a valid reason. I agree.
Yeah.
But when you see it from far, it must be like, oh no, it must be like something deep. Probably had like some internal turmoil. But it can be as simple, but yet very strong reason to make a move. Okay, so
it could also be, if I could add this, it could also be saturation. I think it's fair to say that you can make a move when you're saturated at one position, when you feel you can't contribute anything. It doesn't always have to be money. I also felt the hunger. Look, you have your own business. In a way, you're on your own. Yeah. You have maybe 1 or 2 employees, but you want to have a larger crowd feeling again. So I should add that this is another motivation.
No, but I like the fact that you're vulnerable at the end. It sounds like a very Gen Z thing to say, but it's nice to hear. Yeah. Like it's normal people.
Absolutely.
Decisions. So you came to Vienna, I think 2013, right? And it's the 10th year.
Yes.
So how do you feel?
Especially talking to you, I feel like getting older. It's been an intense time, but perhaps wrapping this up, and it's not giving you compliments all the time, but it's good to work together, and that definitely has made this a very good experience. And the topic we are doing research on is something that I guess carries us on a bit more, and we will have more podcasts about it.
Absolutely.
But how do I feel about it? Mixed bag.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, in order to just wrap this up, we both are at the same place right now. I mean, he's obviously
older.
No, I was about to say in a different hierarchy, but there are a lot of common problems that we both face in terms of being in academia. I think we should discuss this more in the next series of podcasts. But I would like to end the podcast by saying it was wonderful to hear your roller coaster of emotions. I swear to you, I know the guy for like 6 years. I expected something really philosophical or so, but I also understand that sometimes you have to make the right choices. And the choices can be as silly as it can be. It can be either, but these are like strong things. One was for love, and the second was financial stuff.
And luck.
Good. So thanks again for tuning on to us. I don't know if I said it right. Doesn't matter. I'm Indian. I don't care. So anyways, see you on the next episode, and we see better stuff in the next ones.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks very much.